Ladies and gentlemen, Namaskar. Welcome to the 15th edition of the Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol Banega Swasth India at the Anne Michalski Foundation, Better. We are delighted to introduce on Mughal Portraiture, Presence and Absence. Independent art historian Ursula Weekes' upcoming book, Mughal Court Painting in India, follows more than a decade of specialization, writing, and teaching on Mughal art and culture. Her earlier books include Techniques of Drawing from the 15th to the 19th centuries, which traces the historical development of major techniques of drawing in Europe, and Early Engravers and their public investigates the early print culture in Europe in the 15th century. In conversation with author and art historian Yashaswini Chandra, Weekes discusses her latest project and interrogates how portraits were important agents in projecting the religious, social, and political identities of members of the Mughal court. Ursula Weekes is an independent art historian based in London. Specializing in Mughal and Rajput art and culture, she teaches at various academic and musing settings, including the Courtauld Institute of Art, the V&A Academy, and formerly at JNU in Delhi. She is currently writing a book on the Mughal Court Painting in India for Reactant Books Limited. Yashaswini Chandra has a PhD from SOAS University of London, and her research bridges history and art history. Her recent book is titled The Tale of the Horse, A History of India on Horseback, and her forthcoming one comprises a women's history of colonial India. She is an affiliated fellow of the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, New Delhi. Can we have a round of applause for our panel? Thank you.
So I first met Ursula when I was a master's student studying history of art for the first time. Ursula had just arrived in India to do a postdoctorate in Mughal painting and to make the transition from working on European art to working on Mughal painting. But then and we hit it off instantly, and we had a lovely rapport, but then we lost touch, as people do. So I'm very grateful to JLF for giving us this chance to reconnect over our mutual research interest in the Mughals. Ursula is working on a fantastic book on Mughal painting, and I can't wait for it. And hopefully this talk will give you a glimpse into what is to come. So, shall I start? Please do. When I first heard about your upcoming book, I genuinely thought for a second, what more is there to say about Mughal painting? But in fact, as you remind us in your book, there is no end to the depth, diversity, aesthetics, and symbolism of Mughal art. Moreover, the bodies of paintings produced by the imperial and sub-imperial ateliers were enormous, so much so that illustrated manuscripts and paintings are still coming to light. It indicates the importance of the art to the Mughals. As you put it, art was deeply embedded in the rhetoric of Mughal rule. So why don't you begin by explaining that, showing us how painting, specifically portraits, both described and defined the Mughal worldview?
Thank you so much. And I just want to begin by saying an enormous thanks to JLF for this wonderful invitation, and especially to William Dalrymple for it. And also how pleased I am to share this stage with you, Yashaswini, as you've said, about our long connection going back to when I first moved to Delhi and lived there for 6.5 years. You're absolutely right. There is just so much literature in Mughal art. What more can we actually say? You know, it's a field that's witnessed enormous growth in the last 15 to 20 years, especially among historians, not just looking at the imperial center, but looking at issues from the periphery with subaltern voices, feminist voices, thinking about how the Mughals fit into the global dynamics of empire building in the early modern era. And art historians, who are normally slower to catch on, they've also caught on and are moving beyond like tight questions of connoisseurship and style, and actually asking much more questions about like the phenomenological importance of images at the Mughal court. So thinking about how paintings are powerful agents within the intellectual world of the Mughals, and also how they fit into the gift-giving culture of the Mughals. When you said, you genuinely thought, what more is there to say? I thought of my dad, actually. My dad is an eminent kind of retired history professor of Oxford University, and whenever I've been worried about this issue of overlap, he's always said to me, there's always more to say, because history is not a static process. It's a process about our discovery of the past enabling a self-discovery in the present. And so every person has unique questions to ask, if you like, of the past. And as we do that, we really discover more about ourselves. And I think your own work, Yashaswini, is a perfect example that, you've written a history of India on horseback, partly because you love horses. And so the questions that we choose to ask of the past are like framed by our present, both in a kind of broad cultural sense, but also in a kind of micro personal sense. But I want to come to your specific question, which is how painting and portraits both described and defined the Mughal worldview. And what we see with the Mughals is them engaging in that intense historical process themselves. They are looking to develop this new self-identity as they build an empire in India with a very diverse number of peoples here. So as an Indo-Timurid dynasty kind of transplanted from their Central Asian lands into India, they have this very diverse population that includes Sunnis. As rulers, they were Sunnis themselves, but there are many Shias, Hindus, and to a lesser extent also Jains, Abyssinians, Armenians, other foreigners as well at their court. And portraiture is a way of validating and looking at the individual person. And so it's central to the whole policy of Akbar, of his sul-i-kul, of peace to all. So the fact that the Mughals are commissioning all these portraits of themselves, of members of their court, of their wives, of servants of the court, and so on, is a way not only of expressing the diverse personalities of the court, but validating the kind of society they were trying to build, and actually helping to create that through the very act of visualization. Right, we need to come to some art. Can we have our first slide, please? So, that's just a beginning. We'll have the next slide, please. So this is probably the earliest datable Mughal painting. It shows Humayun and his entourage celebrating the circumcision of Akbar. And it takes place at a site not far from Kabul, where there are these beautiful juniper tree groves. Babur writes about that place. And we see in the lower section of the painting Humayun with all the male entourage, and they're all wearing the Taji-Izzat, the special turban of Humayun's reign. And then halfway up the painting at the left, you can see the women of the court. And further up the painting to the right, you can see three little children with their nursemaids. And one of those children is probably the little boy, Akbar. But the thing that I find so fascinating about this picture is that the dynastic presence of Akbar is actually encapsulated in the image that Hindal, Humayun's brother, is presenting to it. So right from the get-go, it shows that the Mughals are interested in portraiture as something that can encapsulate the idea of presence. Next slide. Forward wind to 1615, and this is a famous image by the painter Nanha that shows a very important political moment for the Mughals, because this, after a lot of decades of trying, this is the first moment that they're able to draw the Sisodias into their kind of political sphere, and they show great respect to them because they recognize them as such important kings in North India. And for the first time within a kind of historical painting, we see an artist embed his own self-portrait into the image. And you can just see from that detail, Nanha, and he's drawing a little portrait. of the Rana as if this is like, as it really happens. So this is like quintessentially the kind of moment of portraiture in Mughal art. I think we're on to...
Yeah, that's a fantastic painting because it also shows the importance of Mughal artists. You know, the history of the Mughals was not just recorded, was not just written, but it was also documented through paintings.
Absolutely, and they're like independent historical documents.
Absolutely, and that artists had a front row view very often, a front row seat to political and historical developments.
Definitely.
How did the Mughals overcome the Islamic reservation against figurative art and portraiture specifically? And what were the Neoplatonic principles underlying the Mughal ethos?
Yeah, thank you. Good question. So many of the kind of reservations against figurative art were mediated chiefly through the hadith rather than in the Quran itself. And so over lots of centuries, many Muslim cultures had interpreted that quite loosely. They didn't necessarily have a strict interpretation. And that was especially true in Central Asia and in Iran, where following the kind of Muslim conquests of the 7th century, still these older pre-Islamic modes of thought persist. And so they actually have quite a strong and rich kind of visual tradition, and you only need to think of all the like really early examples of illustrated Shahnamas of Ferdowsi for that. But that said, you know, sometimes these Islamic prohibitions do impact the lives of artists. And in fact, the first two Mughal artists who come and join Humayun and are really credited as the founders of the Mughal school of painting were artists who worked for Shah Tahmasp in Safavid Iran. And basically, Shah Tahmasp spends the first half of his rule having this most incredible painting atelier. And then he has this kind of conversion to a more serious Orthodox Islamic faith, and he then disbands his whole atelier. So Humayun really lucks out because he's just there at the right time and the right place to secure the services of these two artists. So there's plenty of precedent for figurative art. What there isn't plenty of precedent for is this kind of observed portraiture that the Mughals go in for. And so they want to find a way of justifying that, and they turn to Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism is really suffused through that whole Sufi tradition of literature that they love in authors like Jami and Saadi and Surawadi. So what is Neoplatonism? Basically, it's the idea that the material world of appearances is connected to an unseen world of archetypes. And so that as you look at the outward visible signs of a thing, you can actually perceive the inner meaning and realities about it. And Abul Fazl, Akbar's kind of chronicler, says that as you draw a human being, the artist actually gains a deeper understanding of God. So they frame the artist as a kind of worshipper, not a usurper of God. Let's go to the next slide. And these two short portraits show how Mughal confidence in portraiture really develops over a couple of generations. So one is a portrait of Mir Said Ali, one of these two artists that comes from Shah Tahmasp's atelier. And he paints himself pretty much as a kind of generic Persian youth. There's an incredible economy of line there and this beautiful elongated kind of figure. And he's reading a book on his reading stand, but you can just see the white little tablet near his knee, and there are inscriptions on that, and one of them is a signature, and the other gives some very specific historical details. And from that, we can be sure that this is meant to be a self-portrait. And so even though the look is quite kind of generic and not so observed, it definitely is meant to refer to a historic individual, and it raises this issue of portraiture as a matrix between artist, patron, sitter, as it were, a cultural construct, so that recognizability takes place within a particular cultural and context. But then if you forward wind to like 1615, again, it's a similar forward wind that we've done. And this is a lovely portrait of Inayat Khan. Now, Inayat Khan is pretty famous in Mughal art because Jahangir commissions a portrait of him when he's absolutely on death's door. But here we're seeing him a few years earlier, and he's actually holding a little portrait of a European Portuguese figure. If we could go to the next slide, there's a detail of that. And so this shows you, I think, how the Mughals developed this practice of real observed likeness, real naturalism in the face. And part of what they're responding to is the great volume of European art that has come to the court from about 1580 onwards. And has informed really their own practices of observation and portraiture. And yet, the Mughals never fully adopt like a European mode of portraiture. You can see there how much it avoids the real corporeality and real kind of naturalism of Mughal art there. So there's this like confidence in portraiture that is really developing. And they're looking to this Neoplatonism, the illusionism, as a way of enhancing the presence of the sitter. And if we could just go to the next slide. Jahangir was pretty obsessed by this idea himself. And in his memoirs, he records a quatrain that he sends on the back of a portrait that he's sending off to Ibrahim Idil Shah in the Deccan. And this isn't the portrait itself. This is just a beautiful portrait in the Chester Beatty Library. And he says on the quatrain says, "Our merciful glance is always in your direction. Rest assured in the shadow of our felicity. We have sent you our likeness, and here's the key bit, our likeness surat, so that you may see our inner self, Mani, through our external appearance." Another thing I love about this portrait is how it actually captures identity in a more material way as well, through the two sashes that he's wearing. Because can you see how the first little short sash is a beautiful little Rajasthani bandhani sash, and that is expressive of Jahangir's identity. His mother was a Rajput princess. But then the other sash is this beautiful long gold brocade sash.
Thank you for showing us that portrait of the young and vital Inayat Khan, because the well-known one is of him old, decrepit and dying.
Yeah.
As you put it, Mughal painting developed its distinctive look quite quickly, within a decade of Akbar's reign. This is based on a unified style that combined elements of Persian painting and pre-existing traditions of manuscript illustration in North India. Can you tell us a bit about the antecedents of Mughal painting and its evolution into portraiture? It would be fantastic if you could discuss Babur's powers of observations as a precursor to Mughal painting, Humayun's role in kicking things off, and the forceful impact of European art.
Yeah, okay, long question. Let's deal with Babur first. Interestingly, no portraits or art survive commissioned by Babur. We know of manuscripts he owned, but nothing that he actually commissioned. But he was a great believer in the power of the word to describe people and places. And I'm sure that close observation is a practice that then informs the later development of portraiture. I love the way he draws these pen portraits. So, for example, of his father, Umar Sheikh Mirza, he says he was short and fat, and that he would always wear his tunic really tight, and that he would have to hold himself in, it was tied round with these ties, and if ever he forgot to hold himself in, the ties would just burst. And what I like about that is that Babur was actually only 12 years old when his father died, falling into the ravine from his palace as he fed pigeons, and it somehow captures what a 12-year-old boy would find funny about their father. So I really like that example. But as you say, it's Humayun who kicks off the Mughal school of painting. But he dies only a year after regaining India. So really, it's like up to Akbar to develop this unique style. Now, at the outset of his reign, Akbar doesn't actually seem that interested in portraiture. It takes about 20 years into his reign, really, for Mughal portraiture to develop in earnest. If we could have the next slide, please. The thing that Akbar goes for at the very beginning is the huge project of the Hamzanama. It's like an epic, fantastic tale. And the painting in the center is a painting from the Hamzanama. Now, the reason I've chosen that painting is because it's one of the few pages in the Hamzanama where we see Hamza's identity kind of adapted to the prince. Normally, Hamza has a beard and he looks older, but in this particular example, it seems like Akbar's own portrait might have been projected onto the figure of Hamza. So this manuscript is where artists are really beginning to kind of like work together to form a very distinctive Mughal look to their painting. And one of the reasons that Akbar really wants that is partly competition with the Safavid and the Ottoman empires. He wants something distinctive. So how do they do that? Well, they're basically drawing in artists from all over North India. And from the names of those artists, you know, we know that, for example, they came from Gujarat, like Surdas Gujarati, or they came from Kashmir, Ibrahim Kashmiri, or from Gwalior, Nand Gwaliori. And they're also, those artists themselves are already deeply versed in the idea of aesthetic hybridity, because at that point, just prior to the Mughals coming in the early 16th century, you've got like Sultanate painting, you've got painting being patronized in the like Rajput courts, and also in Jain mercantile context. So two of the antecedents that I put up there, on the upper right, you can see the beautiful Sultanate manuscript of the Nimat Nama. This is made by Sultan Ghiyas al-Din at Mandu, and it's his famous cookbook where it describes all these beautiful recipes for biryanis and pan and perfume. And in each illustration, Sultan Ghiyas al-Din is seen, kind of, there's a portrait of him supervising the making of all these delicious things. And then the lower left, you can see this kind of Rajasthani painting tradition just immediately at the cusp of, as the Mughals are coming into India, often called the Chora Panchashika style. This is kind of like a late version of that style. And although they don't have any concept of portraiture, they have a very, very strong concept of characterization. And that actually, you can trace it all the way back to like medieval Indian texts like the Chitra Sutra, where there are so many typologies of characters as well. But then on the right-hand side, I've just put up a page of the Akbarnama, made in the early 1590s. And that kind of shows you, if you like, a more mature, distinct Mughal style, when they've kind of been responding to European art and issues there, but also developing their own very distinct look. And Akbar's the one figure through the Akbarnama who has a really distinctive, iconic likeness, but occasionally you can see other portraits. And if we could just have the next slide, on that little detail there, you can see a portrait of the famous singer Tansen, and just in front of him in blue, his son-in-law, the rather paunchy Naubat Khan. And you can kind of triangulate their identities from other portraits that survive of them.
So that's fascinating what you told us about artists from different regions working in the Mughal atelier. So the Mughal atelier becomes a microcosm for the Mughal Empire. Just as Mughal painting sort of encapsulate the Mughal world as it was developing. So my next question is a bit long, but because it refers to one of the achievements of your research, which is to emphasize the role of the painters. Pre-modern artists may not have been known by posterity like European masters are, but it would be incorrect to say that Mughal painters didn't achieve a certain status and fame as imperial and sub-imperial artists. Moreover, you make it quite clear that artists enjoyed many opportunities, freedom, and mobility under the Mughals, so much so that it seems to have been possible for an artist to leave an emperor's service and enter into that of a prince or a mansabdar or a ranked official. Do tell us about a few leading artists and examples of artists exercising agency. In your book, the draft chapters that I've seen, there are some tantalizing references to friendships between artists and high-class patrons.
So yeah, many Mughal artists did enjoy a high status. Some were absorbed into the Mansabdar system, the military administration of the Mughal Empire. That was the case, for example, with Abdas Samad. And his son, even more so. He is actually, as a young man, quite an important artist. He supervises the whole project of Akbar's Ramayan, which is in the city, Jaipur city palace to this day. And he then kind of stops painting really gradually and rises to a very high mansab under Jahangir. But that's kind of unusual. More is the case is that artists are rewarded by these high status gifts of being given elephants or horses or cash for their art. But those at the top enjoyed quite intimate relationships with the Mughals. And if we could have the next slide. This is a lovely painting showing Abul Hassan as a teenager, and he's presenting a painting to Prince Salim. This is while Salim has his own rebel court and an atelier at Allahabad. And one of the things I love here is how he shows Jahangir. He sort of flatters Jahangir because Jahangir is pointing knowingly at the painting as if he's this wonderful connoisseur, and Jahangir boasts about his own skills of connoisseurship. But the thing I love is the incredible intimacy, because as Abul Hassan gives the painting to Prince Salim, he doesn't let go of it. He actually keeps holding on to it. So it visualizes their connection through touch of the painting itself. If we could have the next slide. We do see some examples of artists in the imperial atelier clearly working for other members of the imperial family. There's a very unusual group of 7 portraits made by Manohar portraying Prince Murad in the late 1580s, 90s. And they probably were great friends because they were similar ages. Manohar was a son of the great Akbari artist Basawan, and they seem to have been born around the same time. And then Murad was put in charge of all the karkhanas from 1584. And I just love the sensual quality really here of how Murad is depicted with a consort. It could possibly be his wife, who was the daughter of Mirza Aziz Kokar, who he was very fond of. But certainly it's quite unusual to see loving couples as a kind of portrait at this stage. If we could have the next slide. A very famous example of artists moving away from the imperial atelier are the 3 Sheikh Hatim, Sheikh Hussein, and Sheikh Ali, who leave the Mughal court. They're kind of made redundant probably around the 1580s. And they go off to Chunar near Varanasi, and they get employed by the ruler, the Bundi ruler, who is at that time governor of Chunar. And he commissions this Ragamala. And this lovely page, Malkosik Raga, is one of those where the image, the portrait of Ratan Singh Harda, has been kind of put onto the male figure that we see there. And next slide. There's another really interesting example that I love, which is the artist Nur Muhammad, who worked for Hamida Banu Begum, but then also worked for Raja Rai Singh of Bikaner. He was one of the Usta artists who'd come from Persia in the 16th century, and to this day still have a lineage in Bikaner. And you can see how he's just moving between these 2 patrons.
Perhaps the body of Mughal paintings that is best known, the most famous, are the allegorical portraits of Jahangir, startling in their use of Christian imagery to depict sacred kingship. A prime example is the iconic painting of Jahangir embracing Shahabbas, the Safavid ruler of Iran, atop a globe. There are so many layers to Jahangiri portraits such as this, that even though they've been extensively studied, you've come up with an incredible new insight. So why don't you take us through this painting?
Thank you so much for asking that question. Yes, so the painting of, can we have the next slide, please? Yeah, so just on the left shows you the painting of Jahangir embracing Shahabbas. This is one of the most iconic of all Mughal paintings. And it was painted in 1615 by Abul Hassan, who we just saw a moment ago as a teenager. Now he is like the chief artist of Jahangir's court, and he lived and breathed the aesthetic hybridity of the Mughal atelier and has this amazing ability to use a symbol with many multivalent meanings to it. So an inscription on the painting says that it was made at this site just outside Ajmer called Nur Chashma. And I actually went out there last week. And if you look on my Instagram, like later today or tomorrow morning, I'm going to have a video telling this sort of whole story. You know, they never met. So the whole painting is kind of like a fiction, right? And there's so much propaganda evident in it. If we could go to the next slide. So ostensibly, it's about the Muslim brotherhood and friendship between two empires. But there's lots of geopolitical kind of flexing. You can see the propaganda of Jahangir's very dominant body, embracing Shahabbas. And there's this very Neoplatonic idea of Jahangir connecting the heavens and the earth. He's lord of both worlds. But this is my amazing new insight, because I was thinking about this issue of Jahangir connecting heaven and earth. And when I tell you this, you've already got a clue with the little details I've put up there. It's so obvious when you actually see it, but I don't think anyone has said it before, that Jahangir actually connects the sun and the recumbent lion. And what is that? It's the Mughal insignia, the recumbent lion and the rising sun that we see fluttering on the standards of lots of, the backgrounds of lots of Mughal paintings, like these Padshanama paintings. So in this incredibly clever way, Abul Hassan is inserting Jahangir's body right into the center of this Mughal heraldic device. So and also in the device is only the rising sun. In this painting here, now we have like the fully risen sun. So I think the other thing I was going to say about that is this symbol, the Shir-ul-Khurshid. It wasn't exclusive to the Mughals. It was also the emblem used by the Safavids and then the Qajar dynasty and the constitutional monarchy of Iran. And so it only adds insult to Shahabbas that he's the one placed on the lamb and not on the lion.
It's incredible. So we have to have a feminist question. Royal women played a prominent role within the Mughal establishment, making a mark as architectural patrons, businesswomen, writers, and power brokers. Although Mughal painting was male-dominated in terms of artist, patron, and subject, it's important to remember that some female artists were active and portraits of certain women were made. Who were these women and how did they manage to stand out? How much was female portraiture at the behest of the concerned women, and how much was it part of the self-fashioning of their husbands? You make an interesting point about a particularly striking portrait of Mumtaz Mahal of the Taj Mahal fame, for example.
Can we have the next slide, please? So I like to draw a distinction, just by the way, between like feminist history and women's history. And in a sense, my answer is more of a women's history answer than a specifically theorized kind of feminist view. But there are these women artists that we know of. One is called Nadira Banu, and I think I've been able to track down that she is actually the daughter of a minor artist in Akbar's court. Her father is Mir Taqi, who we know from one painting in the Jaipur Razamnama. And this lovely image that I've put up here is a painting in the Bharat Kala Bhavan, and it shows a woman in the zanana, and she's an artist. She's taking a portrait. But I love how the portrait alludes to the problem of portraiture of women in a culture where royal women are not meant to be seen. Because the artist we see completely plainly. But do you see how the woman she's drawing is like drawing this veil across her face as if to kind of like hide her gaze from us as the viewer? In terms of like, did women commission portraits of themselves? Yes, I think they sometimes did. There's a lovely example of where Thomas Rowe shows a miniature portrait of a woman to Jahangir, and Jahangir says, "Oh, please, can I have it?" And Thomas Rowe so boldly basically says, "I really like this portrait myself. I don't really want to give it to you, but yes, of course, Emperor, you can have it. And then Jahangir nicely says to him, okay, don't worry, but I'd like to have copies made for my wives. And then if we go to the next slide, one of the most magnificent examples is the beautiful Darashika album. And Jerry Losty, who recently passed away, his amazing work on this album has given so much more texture to it, because he's really shown how through the context of the women within the album, we can see them as the women around Darashika. In this case, his wife, Nadira Banu Begum, not to be confused with that artist, Nadira Banu, but also of Mumtaz Mahal, and so on. What you were referring to about Mumtaz Mahal, I haven't actually put a slide up. You'll have to go and find it yourself. In the Freer Gallery of Art, there's a pen case that shows a portrait of Mumtaz Mahal, naked to the waist down, with beautiful little inscriptions. It's by Abid. And you can go and track that one down yourself in the Freer Gallery of Art.
So we are running short we're running out of time. So shall I ask you about sort of the subaltern classes depictions and the shast?
Sure.
Yeah. So you talked about subaltern figures finding a place within at least the historiography. But the great art historian Mildred Archer wrote that the paintings that were produced by Indian artists for European patrons in the company period democratized Indian art because villagers, workers, and servants became acceptable subject matter. If you were to put aside the colonial imagination that informs many of these company period paintings, it's true that for all its qualities, Mughal art painting is not known for its depictions of the underclass. In historical paintings, as opposed to narrative ones, if the likes of musicians, dancers, or attendants appear as part of an imperial entourage, ordinary subjects are represented in a crowd of onlookers. There are, however, some exceptions. I myself have studied Mughal paintings of Bhil hunters as reflecting the Mughal fascination for their hunting skills. You have discussed a painting of a Bhil couple, self-portraits of artists, and images of ascetics. Some portraits of Europeans at court were also produced. So can you give us some insights?
Yeah, can we have the next slide, please? We've gone... Can we go to the next slide? Yeah, perfect. There are few, as you say, portraits of the kind of like lower class people. The borders of some albums have some beautiful genre details where we see people burnishing paper and cooking and lapidaries polishing stones. The picture on the right is a beautiful portrait of Chuck the wrestler. He was an expert in Pehlwani. And there's a clear sense of like observation there. But also, that portrait, I think, raises the issue of like stereotypes and portraits. And on the left-hand side, you can see this painting of a Bhil couple. And they have these yellow markings on their bodies. So we know that there's this process of actual observation going on. But if you go to the next slide, the amazing thing is that the artist has based it on an engraving from Europe, and that engraving by Theodore de Bry itself is based on drawings by John White made in America, in Virginia, in the 1580s. So what we're seeing in this picture of the Bhil is like a Mughal artist predicating his vision of a local Indian tribe on a European vision of an American tribe 8,000 miles away. So like the layers of absorption there are amazing.
So the final question refers to one of the other big takeaways of your work for me, which has been your study of the shast, small medallion portraits of different emperors set in gold to be worn by the nobility as an aigrette or a pendant, much like the gift of a khilat or ceremonial robe previously worn by the emperor signified the extent of intimacy enjoyed by a noble, so too did that of a shast. So tell us about these gems of Mughal art and how much were they influenced, how much of their form and use was derived from European monarchical culture.
Could we have the next slide? So shast begin really with Akbar when he sets up his Dini Ilahi, a kind of religious special sect or club. And when people are initiated into it, they have to prostrate themselves before him, remove their turban. When they put their turban back on, they're given a little portrait of the emperor to stick into their turban. Jahangir kind of gets rid of the religious associations of Shast, but he loves the idea of an intimate elite. And so in this portrait here, you can see it depicts Jahangir's court, although the painting on the left is a Shah Jahani period painting. And you can see figures wearing these beautiful gold mohurs, which have his portrait embossed in them. And you can also see that in the portrait of Asaf Khan wearing a medallion. Under Jahangir, the idea of Shast gets really associated with the idea of presence in portraiture in response to European medallion portraiture, because the European mode creates this dynamic between the picture plane, between the viewer and the sitter, that articulates an idea of presence. If we could just have the next slide. I love on the left, you can see how it continues into Shah Jahan's reign. On the left picture, you can see Mirza Mukarram Khan Safi, who I think might be a relative forebear of Rana Safi. And he's got his beautiful shast with a pendant pearl of Shah Jahan. Then in the middle is a beautiful, tiny, tiny little teardrop medallion portrait that I discovered in Cambridge a week or two ago, just the size of my fingernail. And that smiling angel is just so precious. It's, again, a very, very tiny little portrait.
So, thank you. That was just absolutely fantastic. And I think we'll take questions now. Yeah? Anyone has any questions? The gentleman in front. Can someone?
Yeah, Ursula, I wanted to ask you, when does, in your opinion, the Mughal period end and the company school of painting start? Because yesterday, Ms. Fraser, I think, sort of mentioned the company school as late Mughal, if I'm not correct.
Yeah.
So in your opinion, is that sort of synonymous, late Mughal and company, or Mughal is separate and company, and which period does it?
I would go along with Olivia 100% that basically the company period is beginning in the late 18th century, as you have like British patrons in places like Calcutta beginning to commission natural history paintings, portraits and so on, and continues on, especially then in the 19th century, in Delhi workshops that are actually organized by British people living in India.
Yeah, it was actually a hybrid style. So the artists were still trained in the Mughal style, and which is why they are as linear as they are. But in terms of subject matter and how they were presented, that was influenced by European art.
Hello.
Yes. There's someone at the...
Here.
Okay. No.
Hi.
Sorry. Okay.
Hello.
The lady, then the gentleman in front.
No, here.
And then the gentleman in the back.
I have to ask something.
No, can the lady finish asking her question?
Yeah, hi. I have a lot of questions actually, but
You can ask only one.
Yeah, I know. I wanted to know if you could tell us a little about the Tota Nama or the Tuti Nama and how it affected like the Mughal court and like what it was about, like because it was.
So the Tuti Nama is an early Mughal manuscript that is a key issue about how you understand the formation of the Mughal style. But as it's not directly about portraiture, maybe you and I can pick it up afterwards.
So the gentleman in front and the gentleman here. So, sir, why don't you ask and then you, Dr. Chavda.
First, to what extent do you feel that Kamaluddin Behzad influenced the Mughal portraiture? And if did the tradition of Manu of Herat Kalam also influence the Mughal portraiture in the medieval times?
Malwa painting. Thank you.
May
Sorry,
I
the
repeat?
pigeons are fluttering here and I couldn't quite get your question. You're asking what's the influence of Malwa painting?
I am asking that, Kamaluddin Behzad of Safavid tradition, did his work or style influence the Mughal portraiture in medieval times to some extent?
I mean, along with many other paramparas around North India, we're having these artists that are being drawn into the atelier. So, of course, they're bringing in different styles and influences. But I think this idea of a really observed portraiture is something that actually gets developed conceptually and in artistic practice within the Mughal court.
I'd like to go back to Abul Hassan and the painting of Shahabbas and Jahangir, the nimbus, or the sun and the lion. I've done a little bit of work on lions and things in Mughal art, and I've always considered the presence of both of these to show Shahabbas as at a lower level because he's standing on a lamb and Jahangir towers over him. So as you said, that the nimbus and the lion are symbolically brought together because it was a symbol of the Mughal dynasty, as indeed it was of the Pahlavi dynasty in Iran. I think that was more accidental than purpose. Would you like to comment on that?
I have to say that I don't think anything with Abul Hassan is accident, because he has this incredible ability, and not just Abul Hassan, but Bichitra and other artists who are really engaged in these allegorical portraits, because what you see is how they so cleverly keep a visual paradigm that they just make one or two little tweaks to it, and suddenly, instead of having like an Islamic concept of how the world is founded, you've got a Hindu concept of how the world is founded. Or suddenly something that's like got a Christian symbolism suddenly has a like completely different slant and a resonance within another culture. So personally, I think that Abul Hassan he's so aware of everything that's going on. What I didn't have time to say is that those animals together, the Dadudam, the lion and the lamb, symbolize a messianic peace. But I think, yeah, for me, it was just like one of those light bulb moments when I suddenly realized that the thing Jahangir actually stands on is not the earth. He's actually standing on the lion. And so although there's this connection point, and you can see it in the composition of the painting between the heavens, you see it in the composition of the circle and the semicircle. So there's this idea of the heaven and the earth. But then, to me, it was just really exciting suddenly to see the Mughal insignia in the heart of that painting.
So Ursula will be available for interaction after the session. So those of you who couldn't ask your question, please have a chat with her, accost her. But I know that the gentleman at the back wearing a mask has been waiting for a very long time. And then there's a lady. I'm sorry, Abhimanyu, you'll just have to wait for the session to end. So these will be our last two questions. But please make it quick.
My question to you, ma'am, is we know the influence of the Western art on Mughal painting. But how about the reverse? How much have the Mughal paintings influenced the Western art? For example, we know that its influence on Rembrandt's work. But are there other artists in the West who are equally influenced by the Mughal art?
So thank you for that question. You've raised like the prime example, if you like, where the circle gets completed. And also the paintings that Rembrandt knows are related to the paintings that end up in Schönbrunn in the Millionenzimmer. That's made in the 17th century, decorated with a combination of actual Mughal paintings and copies of Mughal paintings. One of the, I think that the circle doesn't often get fully completed. One of the things that is interesting is that a gold mohur of Jahangir's portrait gets brought back to London, and just the year after his death, it's turned into an engraved portrait. So that's a good example. And also, you know, just of manuscripts that come to England, for example, very early, like the Lord Rugmala. So, yeah.
Hello, good afternoon everyone. Ma'am, please enlighten us on the art of Mughal after 1600, and does it include surreal art? Surreal art, surrealism.
Well, I think I wouldn't say surrealism, but I would say a very emblematic. So Jahangir, he does portray himself in an abstracted context. I don't think I would go as far as to say surrealism, because that's about putting ridiculous juxtapositions together that make you think about, you know, art and life. But I think he's trying to be more meaningful, allegorical.
Okay, fantastic. So that's it? Yeah? Okay, brilliant. Thank you.
We would like to thank Ursula Weekes and Yashaswini Chandra for this wonderful session. Thank you so much.